Welcome back to another lesson on the parables of Jesus in their historical context. I'm Samantha Corcoran, and in today's video, we're tackling an odd parable. This is the parable of the Shrewd Manager, and some people skip this parable. I used to, because it's a little confusing. Is Jesus praising dishonesty? We've got to investigate this, so we're going to break it down piece by piece to see how a first century listener would have understood this parable. So let's get started. This parable is actually the continued answer that Jesus is giving to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law back in chapter 15. He is still answering their question, and it's taken 4 parables to do it. Remember, they were murmuring, they were complaining, and upset that Jesus was eating with tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus has already addressed them with the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost sons, and now the parable of the shrewd manager. He is really trying to get them to take a different perspective about sinners and tax collectors. They're God's children too. Remember, if you go back to those videos before, which I'll link below if you haven't seen those yet. But this is the final portion of his answer to those Pharisees and tax collectors. In Luke 16, it starts with Jesus telling his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager anymore. You guys, this guy is getting fired. He's being given his notice. He just got called into the manager's office, the owner's office. Whew, I don't know if you've been in that position before. I have once, and it was terrifying. I didn't lose my job in that case. This dishonest money manager has cooked the books and now is being called out for it. And so the rich man, the owner, says, go get your books and bring them here. Then you're gone. That's it. So what's interesting is this man, even though he's just been fired, has a small window of time before he's actually fired. What is he going to do with this window of time? How is he going to use this opportunity? To help us in the 21st century think about what this economic situation, the setup was like in the first century, we're going to take a detour to Downton Abbey. We're going to Downton Abbey, which is really Highclere Castle. It's on my bucket list. The reason I'm showing this to you is because I feel like many of you watching may know something about Downton Abbey. If you know anything about the British aristocracy over the last several hundred years, you know that there are many lovely manor houses across England. And the way that a manor house works, it has its whole economic system around the owner of this house. And so what they do is they own all of the land, thousands and thousands upon thousands of acres of parkland and agricultural land, as well as the surrounding villages. And often the villagers will come help work the land, manage the parks, care for animals, raise animals for food, grow crops for food. And so it is a miniature scale here of an economy. And when we put that into picture, you have the owner at the top who oversees. So the success of the owner means the success of everyone under him. And this is kind of what we're seeing in the parable. We have an owner. He is renting out his land to farmers and producers, as we see in the parable. We'll get to it, but there's olive oil and wheat. So we've got some agriculture happening here. Now, at the beginning of every season, those renting the land from the owner will sign a contract and say, okay, from my harvest, I will give you X percentage. So let's think about that in first century terms here. Now, this is a very large estate, and it takes many, many people to successfully run it. And so this is where we see that business manager role come in. The owner clearly has too much on his plate to manage all of the fine details. And in the case of the first century, sometimes the owner didn't even live in Galilee, but maybe in Rome or other places. So an absent landowner who's coming back to check on things. So he would have had the business manager run the daily operations. And that's what we see in this parable. So going back to the first century setting, we have a very similar economy happening. So what is produced locally is sold locally, and we're just starting to see the emergence of global trade. Some has been happening, but with the Roman Empire, now it's shifting from just an agrarian economy where supply meets demand to now having excess supply that's being sold elsewhere. So they're in a bit of a transition period here. So every season, the landowner would rent out his land to tenant farmers who would promise a portion of their profits at the end of the harvest season. So at the beginning of the season, before planting, they would sign a contract to say what that split was, percentage-wise. For example, my dad is a farmer, and he owns his own ground, but he also rents additional acreage. And so the way he does it is like a 60-40 split. So he keeps 60% of the profits at harvest time. Because think about it, he's got all the equipment, he pays for fuel and fertilizer and all of the seed. He has all of the costs to cover, which, as we know, in our current economy are increasing. So he takes the 60%. He pays 40% to the landowner. And sometimes the landowner is local. Sometimes they live in Kansas City, for example. So in this parable, we're seeing something similar. At the beginning of the season, a contract is signed that says this farmer will pay X amount or X percentage of their profits when harvest comes. So this business manager in the parable is managing all of those contracts. This comes into play next. Let's continue. Continuing in verse 3, it says, the manager said to himself, remember, he's just been fired and he has to bring the books in. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. He's strategizing his next business move, his next job. How is he going to secure his income once this job is over? He's already thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. So he's got a window of time here where he can take advantage of this opportunity before he takes the books back to the owner. So let's see what he does. So digging as a job was usually given to prisoners of war. That is not an ideal job to have in the ancient world, but neither is begging. As we read through the Bible, there's lots of examples of begging, and that would get you a subsistence living, but that's not what this man has in mind. Clearly, he really wants to keep taking care of himself at the same level he's at, or better. So he's thinking ahead about the people that he's currently working with, right? These people he wants to still welcome him over. So he has to hatch a plan here. So this ancient culture had what we would consider to be like reciprocal relationships. So lots of favors. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. So this is why he's thinking, maybe if I can do a favor for these people I'm already working with, maybe they'll do me a favor and maybe give me a job. You guys, that's where he is going with this. He is thinking a couple steps ahead here. Let's see what he does. Verse 5. So he called in each of his master's debtors. These are the people renting the land so they can farm it. Okay. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. He's having him decrease his bill. Now, business managers in this culture could go back, just like they do today. You can go back and amend the contract. What he's doing is he's having him write it in his own handwriting so that this manager is not held accountable. So the manager can change the contract, but usually what they would do is they would change the contract to do the opposite. They would try to extort more money. But this is the opposite. This is him being generous, or rather making the owner look generous. Let's talk about that quantity of olive oil. So olive oil comes from olives, which come from olive trees, and this is a gorgeous olive tree in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, yes, there are still olive trees in the garden where Jesus prayed today. Now, these were not necessarily present when Jesus was literally there praying, but they are very close to his time period. These are at least 1,500-year-old trees. I've got a great article in the description below. The monks at the church that is in the garden still harvest the olives from these trees in the Garden of Gethsemane and make olive oil. I've got a great video that I will link for you up above here, and it shows olive oil production, how it would have been in the first century. They even have the cutest donkey at the millstone. You've got to watch it just for the donkey. He's adorable. But it shows you the labor-intensive process that you go through, or they would have gone through, to make olive oil that was good for eating and drinking and medicine and cosmetics. The video is from Nazareth Village, and it's about 2 or 3 minutes or so. It's a great video. I'll link it in the description below. Go take a look. So you can see what it was like to make olive oil. It's fascinating. So, by the way, in order to make 900 gallons of olive oil, you need about 150 trees. That is not just mom and dad's farm. That is a huge industrial scale agricultural operation. That's massive, because you think about if his profits are split 60-40, this renter, he keeps 60%. He has to pay the 40. If the 900 gallons is the 40%, he has to make even more than that. So he has profit to pay his own debts and equipment costs and all of that, so they can survive. That is a lot of olive oil. This would have cost around 1,000 denarii. That's the money equivalent of 900 gallons of olive oil. And so what this business manager is doing, he's basically dropping 500 denarii off of his bill. It's very generous, don't you think? Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill, make it 800. So you can picture him handing over a piece of parchment or papyrus and writing, scribbling in ink, in Aramaic. Scratch out 1,000, make it 800. In their own handwriting. What is 1,000 bushels of wheat? What is this? This is the equivalent of what's grown on 100 acres of land. This is a lovely wheat field in Israel today. Just to give you the picture, here in Kansas, we're spoiled. We see wheat fields right and left. And the equivalent of 1,000 bushels of wheat in those times would have been about 2,500 denarii. And now, here again, he is dropping about 500 denarii. He's cutting his bill. Think about how this would have been harvested by hand, right? And no modern equipment, no harvester machines. They would have had the scythe and, cut it, and people come behind, gather it into bundles. They'd take it to the threshing floor. You know the drill. Remember the story of Ruth, right? This is what they would have had to do to harvest those 100 acres of land to then get the 1,000 bushels of wheat. So what's interesting is that these contracts that are now being modified to forgive a certain amount of the debt, they would have been public knowledge. This was not done under the carpet necessarily, although it was done away from the owner. We have an ancient document from the Mishnah. It's commentary, Jewish commentary. It's called the Baba Batra, and it talks about how the contracts would have been public knowledge and known to the master. So he knew what the initial contracts were. So he knew. And he's now about to see what the revision turns out to be, which he'll get when the manager turns in his books next, in the next part of the story. How did these two renters, these two land renters, how did they view the forgiving of their debts? Instead of owing 40%, now it's less. Landowners would reduce or forgive debts in times of crisis or famine, and those who were forgiven normally praised the creditor as benevolent in return. If that were you, if you were renting this ground, you've got a family to feed, you've got costs to pay. How would you view what this business manager just did? Now, by the way, they don't know he's fired yet. They don't know that part. I think if they had known he was fired, they would not have gone along with his plan. They would not have written in their own handwriting. So they don't know. They chalk this up to the owner's generosity. Well, look how generous he is. Look how benevolent he is. He reduced our debt. Well, that's very kind. We should praise him. So I want you to see the shrewdness that this business manager, who's about to be fired, he uses this window of opportunity to show generosity towards his friends, the people who are renting the land, so he can secure his own next job after he's officially fired from this one. He's thinking ahead. This landowner now sees the genius, the shrewdness in his business manager's plan. Because if you think about it, if the owner protests, if he says, wait, this dishonest guy, he just acted on his own, and then if he tries to get his money back, then how will those renters view him? He's not going to do that. That would put his reputation on the line. So he can't go back and ask for his money back. You go fix that contract, put it back. Oh, it's too late for that. As far as his account ledger looks, this lower income is now attributed to generosity rather than mismanagement on the business manager's part. So what this guy did was completely dishonest and unjust, but it sure made his owner look good, right? It sure made the landowner look great and generous, and people would have honored him. Well, that was very clever indeed. Jesus continues by saying, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings." You might be wondering, what is that phrase about people of the light? What does that even mean? Well, it turns out this phrase is actually used multiple times in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the group that is thought to have written the Dead Sea Scrolls, called the Essenes, they considered themselves as people of the light, children of the light. They were the true followers of God. They had been former priests at the temple, and they were so disgusted by the corrupt practices at the temple that they just hightailed it out to the desert and made a monastery-like area and wrote all of these scrolls, in addition to having copies of all the books of the Bible, except Esther. I digress. So the people of the light is a loaded phrase that's referring to the end times. It's referring to what scholars call eschatology, which is a study of the end times. And so it's basically, you've got the children of the light who follow God. Everybody else is child of the darkness who does not follow God. And so when Jesus uses this phrase, that's telling us he wants us to think about what happens after we die. What happens when eventually when he returns. But they don't know that yet in the first century. So they would have heard this as a loaded phrase, meaning at the end of the age, then what? Okay, so he's saying, the people of this world, children of darkness, are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. Klein Snodgrass thinks that Jesus, using this negative example of a child of darkness, so to speak, is an accusation against the children of the light. He's calling out the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. He says, the steward, as a child of this age, knew how to handle the system to his best advantage. Right? So he wouldn't be left without a job. Yeah, he's thinking of his future prospects. He's streetwise, as the Message translation puts it. But the children of light are just here living by the rules, hoping it gets them by. They're not being strategic about how they live within their system. And really, this is a how much more parable. So if this dishonest business manager can find a way to secure his next job when he's currently being fired from one, if he can use money as a tool to benefit his friends, if he can do that in his system, how much more should we, as followers of God, followers of Jesus, be able to be shrewd for the kingdom? This actually concludes the parable proper, just the parable by itself. But you'll notice it continues. Jesus continues, and he actually speaks in poetry. He tells this very skillful poem about the dangers of money. You guys, this is an economic parable, and Jesus is about to get into your pocketbook. So he says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So this NIV translation says money. The actual word is Mamon, and it's capitalized. It's a proper noun because Mamon is money personified as a deity, as a god, as a separate God from the one true God. And Jesus is contrasting them to say, you have to pick one. You have to make a decision. You cannot follow both. Scholar Kenneth Bailey has written about this, and it is beautiful. I want to share this poem with you in the original language so you can see the play on words that are happening. And the poem continues in verse 11, and it's beautiful if you can read it in the original language. We miss it because we read in English, But if you read in the original language, there is this beautiful section of wordplay. And it's a riff off of Amen, because in the original language, it's apostrophe M in. But as you remember, there's no vowels. Those are added. And there are multiple words that are spelled M-in, but different vowels turn it into a different meaning. And so this poem at the end is playing on the word for what do you place your trust in? What is trustworthy? Are you trustworthy? And so it says, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with the true riches? So it's a beautiful wordplay in the poetry here. But Jesus is saying you have to make a decision on who or what you put your trust in. And it goes back to this dishonest manager in the story, in the parable that Jesus just told. Look at how he used money as a tool, not something to be worshipped. He used money as a means to an end. He used it to help his friends. And how much more can we, as followers of God, be smart about how we use the money that God gives us, right? It's not our own. And Jesus is using this to talk to answer the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Again, Klein Snodgrass points out that just as the steward acted in this world to safeguard his well-being, how much more in this eschatological crisis, judgment is coming, should Jesus' hearers act to safeguard their own eternal well-being? Wisdom calls for using wealth astutely in view of the presence of the kingdom and coming judgment, given kingdom economics. And rather than just using wealth for self-centered purposes, just for enjoying life, right? We are called to something higher. Now, at my church congregation, once a year, the elders will talk to the congregation on a Sunday and explain the yearly budget. You may have sat through one of these yourself, but they go through every budget detail. All the members are given a report to review. We talk about it, we debate, and then everyone agrees, and we move forward with the annual budget. But what if we took as much care helping individual members with their financial budgets? Ooh, is this stepping on toes yet? I don't want people looking at my business, what I spend my money on. Yeah, you guys, seriously. What if we did that? Could we help each other be more strategic about our spending? And if we truly believe this gospel that we're preaching, why wouldn't we put our money where our mouth is? Why wouldn't we use the money God gives us to fund activities for the kingdom? So I have a confession to make. See my Starbucks tea? It's my favorite tea. It is a Trenta iced green tea with no sweetener. Okay. You guys, I get one of these a day. And I have for the whole pandemic. It's kind of a comfort thing for me. Security maybe. But I looked at how much it costs. Now I usually use my phone and pay for it with the app, and I don't look at money. That's dangerous. That's terrible. Okay. My tea, let's just say it costs $5. Rounding up just for calculations here, estimating. So during the 2 years-ish of the pandemic, let's say I've had one of these a day. I usually get one before I go teach class. Keeps me hydrated, right? Okay. $5 a day, 365 days for 2 years. That's $3,600 for tea, for flavored water, that I could honestly make at home. You guys, I have the tea bags. I have an electric kettle. I have water. What's my holdup? I have a spending problem. And I am openly admitting this. And you might think, oh, seriously, it's just tea. Enjoy your tea. You make enough money. You teach at a college. Just drink your tea. Okay. Well, thank you for that. But couldn't I spend this money on something for the kingdom instead? I mean, really, I could seriously make my own tea. And then what could I do with $3,600? Well, I could help support our local church soup kitchen. You could help feed the hungry. Many meals. I could help support another organization we have called Simple House. They help people who need clothing, those who are homeless. I could support a group of girls at a girls' home called Carpenter Place. Gosh, I could help them do some fun summer activities or some educational opportunities or field trips. And now I feel really guilty because I could have done that. I mean, I definitely can't now. I've already spent the money. Honestly, the tea's not that good. But helping people would have been so much better and more rewarding, don't you think? So, I've got some budget reviewing to do with my husband. I've got to have some accountability here for how I'm spending my money, because if I believe in this gospel, wouldn't I want everyone else to know about it too? And if God's giving me this money, am I spending it strategically? You guys, this hurts. I kind of like getting my tea every day, but am I following what Jesus is saying here? Am I answering his challenge? I'm not at the moment. And it hurts to admit that. And we can try to rationalize it every which way that we want. But isn't that what the Pharisees did? If we continue, the Pharisees who loved money, which, by the way, that's Luke's editorial. He didn't like Pharisees very much, and you can see that throughout his book. He's pretty hard on Pharisees. Jesus said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts." So think about this week. How are you using your money and possessions for the kingdom? What are you doing here on earth strategically for your eternal well-being? Now, realizing you can't buy your way into heaven, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, are we being as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves? To use another saying of Jesus. Evaluate your own life this week. Hold yourself accountable. See if you can meet Jesus' challenge that he's giving to these Pharisees and the teachers of the law to answer them about why he's including sinners and tax collectors in this new kingdom. And I want you to be able to take action on every one of these parables, every one of these challenges that Jesus gives to us. They're hard. They are not easy, as you have seen before if you've watched the previous videos. But together we can do this. So I'm going to reevaluate how I'm spending my money this week. And I hope you'll consider it too. Join me in the next video where we'll talk about the rich man and Lazarus. Was it a parable? Was it just a story? Was it real life? Come back and find out, and I'll see you then.